I am delighted to welcome everyone to this session. My name is Dan McCannon. I teach at Harvard Divinity School, and I'm part of the leadership team for the International Communal Studies Association. So I'm delighted to welcome everybody who's here listening live, as well as to those of you who may be listening after the fact on the recording. We have three really exciting presentations in this 90-minute session. So we'll get started right away. Our first presenter is Iuval Clejan, who is trained as a physicist and has worked as a process simulation engineer, a molecular biologist, and as a farmer. Farmer, of course, is a blend of process simulation and molecular biology. Iuval is interested in cultural genesis, local economies, emergence, and multi-level selection, and he will be speaking on our intentional communities missing something important: the case for deep interdependence and community-supported community. Iuval.
Hi. So yeah, maybe intentional communities are missing more than one important thing, but I just want to talk about one that perhaps people are not aware of, and that is a hypothesis I have. I hope at some point I can make it more compelling than I will during this presentation, which is that capitalism, global capitalism, has a membrane dissolving or weakening effect. And this is happening not just on intentional community membranes. There's some work from Yuval on this, and I'm not too familiar, but I'm sure Shlomo also has work on this from his book on the effect on kibbutzim. But it's also happening, it has happened with villages, tribes, families, and even now with the attention economy and integrated psychological individuals. And I think it also is weakening the power of nation states. So there's empirical evidence from psychology, from demographics, obvious that a lot more people used to live in villages before the Industrial Revolution. From psychology, the family is not as strong, many problems with the families today compared to before the Industrial Revolution, and the family is declining. There is evidence that in biology that when you have organisms and cells, an important factor is the strength of the membrane, and it's not for sure that capitalism is the cause of this membrane weakening and dissolution. I mean, it could be other things like modernity or the weakening of religious beliefs or things like that. But I want to make the point, although I'm not going to do it in this presentation. I would like you to bear with me and assume that it's true for now. So if it's the case that capitalism does this, and that we need membranes, according to everything we know from emergence theory and multi-level selection and biology, in order to have a function and a meaning and interpretation and cohesion and resilience, then here we need to think of this as an inoculation problem. So capitalism is like a virus that is dissolving our intentional community and other things, like I said, families and individuals' membranes. So what do we need to do is we need to have inoculation members, and I want to quickly present three of them. The first is mutual economic commitment. I will talk about that in the next slide. Then next one is a unifying narrative. A lot has been said about this. And the third one is what I call proper nesting of resource production and allocation of levels. The intentional community is only one level. You have families that have to happen below that, and individuals below that. And there's other levels below that, but we won't talk about them. And there's also higher levels. But anyway, I'll talk about that in more slides. So the first measure is of inoculation is a mutual economic commitment. And in the past, before the Industrial Revolution especially, and less after, this was a given that villages or tribes would produce more and allocate more internally than externally. And here is a picture of Tevye from the well-known play and movie Fiddler on the Roof. And all I want to show, which is not shown very well, but you can imagine if you've ever seen the movie, that there is a very rich, diverse, and interconnected network within the village or the community of all kinds of producers. And of course, they are also consumers. And they prioritize each other before they prioritize outside the village. But of course, they do have connections outside the village. And also they prioritize their families first. They prioritize individuals first, and then the family, and then the community, and each level is prioritizing more than the others, than the higher levels. So the second thing that is well known as an inoculation measure is to have a unifying narrative, and this is something that was studied by many people, including David Sloan Wilson in his book Darwin's Cathedral and many papers, and also IC scholars like Richard Sosis and Elizabeth Cantor. And religion is usually the case where we have a unifying narrative, but it could be also a secular ideology like socialism was for the kibbutzes. And this graph just shows that how much it helps with one measure of intentional community success, which is the lifespan. I speculate that if other measures were studied, they would show the same kind of difference, that the religious ones, or the ones that have a strong secular ideology, do better than the ones that don't have religion or secular ideology. Things like member happiness or turnover. So we need data about that, but I predict that the same kind of difference between secular without strong unifying ideology and religious will appear in that data. The third one, which is relatively a new thing as far as I know, is that, and this comes right now from theory and also a little bit from biology. You can look up researchers like Terence Deacon and also Michael Levin, who's a developmental biologist. And we have to have something like nested Marioshka dolls, where, like I said before, within each level, there's much more sharing of resources than outside of that level. And this would mean that we have integrated individuals that share more within themselves than families, that share more within themselves than ICs, villages, or even companies, that share more within themselves than federations, that share more within themselves than nation, more within themselves than the United Nations. And capitalism basically only wants two levels. It selects for our dopamine-seeking parts of our psychology and big corporations. That's it. It dissolves everything else. So it goes against this thing that biology and nature have been doing for a long time, that maintains level integrity. And so no wonder ICs are having trouble. There are only one example of a level, but also families, individuals, nations, everything is having trouble with global capitalism. The third inoculation measure, but for some reason, you can't see the whole slide. That is too bad. I want to say that we can have something like, anyway, so we can have more resource sharing within than without, and resources also include information and meaning. There's two reasons for this from emergence theory. One is that free rider costs increase more slowly once you have a new level. Then if you just keep the same level and increase the number of parts, there's a sort of generalized Dunbar number. So it's not just for a tribe or a community, but at each level, there is a maximum number of parts where if you keep increasing the number of parts, the costs of managing free riding and other information become too great. So it pays to have a higher level instead of just increasing the number of parts at that level. And the second reason from emergence theory for having more levels is that you can have and not just more levels, but keeping the information sharing and resource sharing stronger within a level than without, is that it leads to evolvability, which roughly maps to freedom and also resilience of the lower levels.
5-minute warning.
5 minutes. Okay, so and then we have a paper recently, not our paper, but from the Royal, published in Royal Proceedings of Royal Society, that basically just says what was well known from multi-level selection, that if each level has its own environmental domain, then you could have a higher stewardship. So this actually is in contradiction with things like the problem of managing problems like the commons, the atmosphere, the oceans with global warming, because in order to have a level for the whole Earth, according to standard multi-level selection, you need competition with other entities at that level, which would mean other planets, and we don't have that at this point. But we do have things like foresight and things like that could counter that. And I claim that actually the proper nesting would also help with this, although that's another argument that is complicated to make. Also, Aharon will hopefully talk about another thing about having more localized levels like the intentional community, instead of skipping from just an individual to a nation state, which is that the feedback speed and signal quality, it's less noisy, improve with the localization of resource production and distribution. Okay, so community-supported community is one way to implement proper nesting at and below the IC level. I have much written about this. I can send you links later, but basically diverse companies at the level of individual families. The primary goal of the family-run business is supply goods and services to the overall community with formal agreements in place. Rather than prioritizing outside markets, the community-supported community model relegates them to a secondary role for liquidation of surplus after the needs of the community have been addressed to the greatest extent possible through the internal economy. I don't think, but I'm not sure that even the renewed kibbutz is doing this. I would love to talk to Shlomo about it. Okay, so this is really unfortunate that I have this window at the top here. This was unforeseen, that is not showing the top of my presentation. Okay, so the other thing is we can have a bridge between liberals and conservatives, that this community-supported community model. By the way, that comes from community-supported agriculture. I just want it to be more than just vegetables and dairy and meat. Like, I'm thinking as much as can be produced within the community. So liberals and conservatives is a whole new thing that we have to wrap our minds around. It's much more complicated than just a political ideology. There is much more to it. There is something that precedes even our own species with liberals and conservatives. And basically, to summarize, liberal traits provide imagination, innovation, abundance, and an interesting outward-looking life in an intentional community. But there's liberals and conservative traits at each level of organization. Here, I'm just talking about ICs. And conservative traits provide resilience in times of scarcity or conflict, cohesion, and an inward-looking life in an IC. Both are important. A lot of communities don't do well if they have mostly one or mostly the other. Both are important. What proportion, we don't know, subject of research. And community-supported communities might initially appeal more to conservatives, but there might be ways to make them more appealing to liberals. And also there will be less polarization at IC level than at national due to feedback. Aharon will talk about that, and hopefully Chris Aharon Lavi and Chris Congleton will hopefully talk more about these phenotypes and why they are so important to understand and to help us in order to make intentional communities better. I am done. How did I do?
You actually beat your intended 15-minute goal by 1 minute, so that is great. If you just hit stop sharing, then we'll be able to see one another a little bit better.
Okay.
And we have 10 minutes for questions, and so if you'd like to ask a question of Yuval, just use the raise hand function internal to Zoom, and I will recognize people as I see them. And as people are working up their courage, I will just start by asking you a little bit about community networks, like the kibbutz movement or the Campbell movement, or even a slightly looser network like the Global Eco Village Network. How do you see those as contributing to the nesting that you're talking about?
Well, they are helping with information for sure, but I am envisioning that also these networks will be economic networks. So these networks are all helping with information flow, which is a resource. But I think in order to create a strong higher level above the IC, above the community level, they also will need to be trade networks between intentional communities that will allow some of the current benefits that we have from a global economy to actualize, but at the same time providing an alternative to global capitalism. And you know, when I talk about capitalism, I don't want to pick about on capitalism, and it's not a purely Marxist critique. It's also there's other elements to the critique. Then the problem is not private property. The problem is how resources are shared and at what level. And I envision that networks, economic networks, would help with that, not solely information flow networks as they are now. It's more of a distributist critique, but anyway, there's Marxist elements. Go on, Aharon.
Yeah, I want to challenge, and it's a question which is also a challenge. The model can seem very appealing for certain commodities or certain economic functions, you know, locally grown food, furniture, maybe services such as education, you know, and barbers and stuff like that. But when you think about more complex products which require economy of scale, let's say a car, you can't really produce a car at the communal level. A car has so many ingredients from thousands of places. How do we?
Yes.
I mean, that's the upside and downside of capitalism. It enables those faceless products that you just arrive at the store and you have no idea how they came there. And the downside is that you don't know who they are. There's no human connection. It just pops up at the store or shop or online, whatever.
Well, also the downside is that it destroys these intermediate levels, and I think that I think we're going to have to decide between the trade-offs, what you know, the pros and the cons of whether we want these nameless, efficient products that are destroying our environment and our communities, or whether we want to do something different. It's not like before the Industrial Revolution, everybody was materially miserable. I think also we can not only learn from pre-industrial economies. You say cars, there's horses, there's mules, there's horse carriages. I lived with among Amish people, not with them, but very neighboring. They have great technologies that are pre-industrial, that are localized. And I think not only can we learn from past economies, but we can make a concerted effort. I mean, I'm an engineer to figure out how to localize all these things that right now are global. This is a technological problem, not a ecological or an economic problem. How can we do this? I want engineers to start innovating on how to recycle plastics, how to upcycle plastics, how to 3D print with local plastics and other upcycled products, how to use. I actually worked on something that converts water falling down into high voltages, which was used for an electric fence. I believe we can do almost anything that today can be done with the industrial economy, with local products. We just need to shift our paradigm to be able to produce things locally, mostly. Now, of course, this sounds a bit extremist, and perhaps some things could still be global. And so I'm saying, let's have these global economic networks, but we need to produce most things locally, because this is the way to keep our communities intact, our families, our own individual collective parts integrated. If we do what capitalism does, we are doomed. All these intermediate levels go away. And of course, we need more conservative people to help us keep these lower levels together. But that's a different issue.
Christopher, did I see you raising your hand?
Chris, we can't hear you.
I was just cheering Yuval, but if I'm happy to, I'll raise my hand in a moment if no one else does.
Anybody who's not presenting want to pose a question? I think, Chris, you've got the floor.
Yuval, you did a great job getting through a lot of really complex information. I'm wondering if you could speak a little more about multi-level selection and what it means in this context.
Well, there is like a one sentence summary of multi-level selection, but I don't remember it due to Wilson and Wilson. Something like there is cooperation that happens within a level, but that is driven actually by competition between that level and other such levels. You know, the fact that our bodies are so well cooperating, the cells and the organs in our bodies, is partially driven by our bodies competing against other bodies. So the bodies that cooperate well internally do better evolutionarily. But then you can say, well, let's have another level of a family, and then families that have internal cohesion and synergy do better than families that don't. Of other things being equal, there are other things besides the internal core. And then you can go beyond families to community. And so that's the basic idea of multi-level selection, that there's these levels of organization, and there's initially competition between levels and cooperation within. That's what these levels do, is they reduce the internal competition, increase the synergy and cooperation internally. But that makes them more competitive, actually. But then if you want to reduce that competition, you need a level above that. So that's the basic idea of multi-level selection. There's many unanswered questions about how these levels actually form in the first place. And things like I said, these level-dependent Dunbar numbers, you know, that if you have, there's all kinds of issues with synergy, and there's issues with, what do you call it, the thing that Schumacher figured out, where subsidiarity, where you know, it makes sense to, as far as a management problem, to not micromanage the lower levels, to let them do their own thing. Anyway, there's all kinds of questions, and Daniel Schmachtenberger is someone who is looking at this at a global scale, and he's also being informed by these issues. And the main take home that I would give to people who are looking at this at global levels is, don't skip levels. And intentional community is an important level. You could have other things, perhaps like villages or tribes, but it's a level of human organization that should not be skipped, or else you're going to have all kinds of free riding problems. If you have too many individuals to manage. And the thing about intentional communities is also, I would tell them, don't skip the family. If you have too many individuals without families in between, you will have all kinds of conflict that's totally avoidable if you just have families. Do you want to spend most of your time in conflict resolution, or do you want to actually create beautiful things and commune with each other? So have families, otherwise you will waste time with conflict resolution. Some people enjoy that though. So anyway, okay.
Wow, you just got my head spinning there, but that is the time we have for questions and answers. So please join me in thanking Yuval for a very stimulating presentation. And where am I? Our next speaker is Christopher Congleton, who has been studying collective action for global resilience for 20 years. He brings the perspectives of emergence theory, organizational management, intentional community development, and applied evolutionary game theory to this work, and he will be speaking on Towards Intentional Community Success, Building a Comparative Model for Hypothesis Testing. Christopher.
Thank you so much, Stan. Let me get my screen going. I give, and then, all right. So, what I put in my abstract on the website is sort of a teaser, and so I'm going to present sort of the preliminary steps of how we might go about performing that, and I need help from people. So my presentation is partly a call for people to join us in what I hope will be a compelling but also challenging and very interesting research endeavor. So here's just an overview of what we're going to cover today. I think we're living through very interesting times, that intentional communities may be a really important part of what's happening. And that goes with what Yuval was just talking about, that different levels become more important when we're trying to do something at a higher level. We have lots of stuff going on now with authoritarian tendencies and democracies. And our traditional narratives call for a deeper understanding of our own nature and social dynamics. So, you know, Yuval and I in particular, we started a small nonprofit called the CARE Institute. We're intentional community researchers with a hypothesis that intentional communities, eco-villages, or something similar at that scale may figure really prominently in the success of our species to transition away from ecological and social catastrophe, and hopefully within a generation's time. But we need help. We suspect that the reasons we're not achieving a lot of the goals of a better world today has to do with parts of our human nature that we're not able to face or understand well. It may not just be a failure of our institutions or malevolent actors, but it's collective work, the difficult work of accepting and understanding our own nature as a species, and that there may be multiple natures to who and what we are. So I think we want intentional communities to grow. We want them to be able to maintain their values, and we want to actually change the world. And so I'm just going to keep moving. I was a slide behind. So this is actually a really important component. This is a lot of what Yuval was talking about. We've had a shift from genetic to cultural evolution. We're now evolving more through cultural traits at really large levels of nation states, religions, and in evolutionary theory, this is called fitness export. It means that group level social and technological adaptations are becoming more crucial than genetic traits. And human organizations are transitioning from focusing on individuals to focusing on groups. And this, I should mention, this happened a long time ago. We're just dealing with the effects of that at this point. Part of the human evolutionary transition in individuality has to do with us becoming more selected by groups than by individuals in our evolution. And so this leads to the formation of what we could call cultural superorganisms. And these represent a new level of human organization that are driven more by cultural evolution than genetics. And so the challenge for global cooperation and this wearing it all preprint is largely what I'm drawing these points from. It really highlights this problem with human nature, which is that because we've been evolved into these competing groups that exploit resources better, more technologically. Oh no! Please go, son. Sorry. We have this tendency towards competition and conflict between groups. And this competitive nature actually makes it really difficult for us to cooperate on a global scale, which actually is very necessary to address environmental crisis effectively. I hate to quote Ronald Reagan, but I think he said something along the lines once of, I would love for there to be world peace, but the only way we're ever going to get that is if there's an alien and we're all banded together fighting the alien. And that turns out to be a very salient thing that's true for some of us and maybe not true for others. So there's this self-reinforcing competitive feedback, and there's a tendency in evolution that goes against cooperation between groups. And the only way to avoid that is to have this higher group at a higher level that allows the previously competing groups to be part of something larger. But there's reasons in our nature why that's very difficult to achieve. Okay. So when we look at our evolutionary past, we want to think about how human beings became the groups that they are today. And what is the effect of being a group have on us as individuals? During our evolutionary past, a lot of the things that made us who we are made us effective groups. And it made us effective groups in competition with one another. And this is partly why there's things like ethnocentrism and outgroup bias, hierarchical structures, and some significant parts of our nature that allow us to be amazing social species are also things that make it hard for us to work together as a whole species. So David Stone Wilson and others wrote a paper that looks at our religious nature from a cultural and ecological standpoint, and they identified a bunch of different axes. I haven't listed all of them here. These are the ones that I think are the most relevant that relate to intergroup competition and are a result of that. And this is looking at the diversity of religions, which I think is also useful when we're thinking about intentional communities. And the different preferences that different people have for all the varieties of intentional communities there are, secular versus religious, those kinds of things. And so I think you can sort of look through these different axes and you can see that there's different styles of community group. And those different styles have evolutionary reasons that they exist. And the paper highlights the role of intergroup conflict and makes a lot of evolutionary arguments for why these axes exist. And so what we would like to propose is that there's different types of religious diversity that come from intergroup competition in particular, that either the absence of intergroup competition or living through high levels of intergroup competition actually result in different types of cultures, different types of societies. And so what I'm calling HICS, or high intergroup competition cultures, are more likely to have strict moral framing. They're more likely to have tighter control over the here, I'm gonna check my notes here. I'm so sorry. These communities are focused on tradition, stability, in-group cohesion. They are more adapted to environments where intergroup competition is common. They need a strong group defense and cohesion in conflict scenarios. LIC communities, the low intergroup competition cultures, benefit more from adaptability and openness in a cooperative setting, because they existed in the intersection of different cultural groups in places where there was more abundant resources. So instead of having to have intergroup competition, they had more migratory behaviors, more individualism. Their cultures are less focused on doctrine and ritual, and they're more focused on big events that are shared as a group, like fireworks displays, or some kind of shared event where you witness something or participate in something, but it's like once a year. And then fast, slow life history actually has to do with how dangerous the environment is. And so when there's more resources and less danger, organisms tend to have less offspring and invest more in the smaller number of offspring. Whereas in fast life history situations, evolutionary circumstances, there's a tendency to have more children and to invest less in them, because you're just trying to fill the environment with things that fight each other. And so this also correlates with high intergroup competition versus low intergroup competition. And then we also hypothesize that our cultural development as a species has evolved human groups into mixtures of proportions of individuals who have sort of an innate preference for HIC institutions or LIC institutions, because each of them provides different evolutionary functions to the group. And over time, our groups have evolved to have both of these groups in them to rise and kind of have more political control during different ecological situations. So in times of peace and prosperity, LICs are more likely to be dominant, whereas in times of scarcity, HICs are more likely to come to the front and potentially even be aggressive towards other groups in order to gain resources. And so I think intentional communities can be analyzed across these axes, revealing the correlations of these different axes, testing whether HICs and LICs even exist at the level of the group or within groups with individuals. We don't know. I'm speculating. This is all speculation, but I'm offering these two group level cultural patterns that take specific aspects of these different axes and collect them into something. And then, the religious axes are these emergent group qualities, but there's probably a spectrum of these traits at the individual level that are changed during a lifespan. Some people could probably be pulled into one through life circumstance and out of one through life circumstance. We're mixtures of these aspects individually, and as groups, we represent different proportions of these. So I think if we can incorporate and accept that a lot of our political differences are not merely ideology, but they actually have a biological basis in our bodies. They represent phenotypes. that could help us do better community design, conflict resolution, better cohesion with different types of people's preferences, and then interact better with the communities that we're embedded in. So this also, a lot of this multi-level selection stuff also means that we can affect cultural evolution for our species, perhaps at starting with an intentional community level. We have better cooperation between the Licks and the Hicks at smaller scales, groups of 150 to 500 people. There's really good benefits that could sort of trickle up. One is a manageable scale for experimenting, solving problems. We build trust and understanding. We have common challenges. It's an easier context to build shared goals and shared values, even though we have different perceptions and predilections. And then we can demonstrate success that can be part of a feedback loop that goes up to higher levels. And then this can also prevent the escalation of conflicts and polarization at these higher levels because they're being dealt with at the lower level. So I did a lit review on success in intentional communities, and there's some that aren't listed here that should be, and I think there's other presenters at this conference. I'm not able to say their name properly, but some of their names should be in here. That they have recent scholarships. Someone's dissertation is all about this, but a lot of intentional communities have taken a more relativistic approach to defining success, and sort of critiqued Cantor's original work, looking at longevity, looking at and said, well, if we are satisfied with certain things or achieving the social ends of our aims, even if the community disbanded, we're still a great success. That's wonderful. Yuval and I met in an intentional community. It's disbanded. We're still deeply connected with a lot of people from there. We're still making the world a better place together. And in our interest, when we're looking at evolutionary modeling, we absolutely need to look at whether there's cultural fidelity and preservation of the core values of an organization, whether there's population growth or stability and low turnover. And we're not implying any, judgment that other metrics are not good enough. But for our purposes of studying evolution and trying to help intentional communities be part of a global solution to things like war and inequity, we think we need to measure it this way. And one of the strange projects we'd like to invite people to join us in is creating measurable metrics. And measurable metrics is a sort of way to look at intentional communities over time and to model them evolutionarily. And to do that, we have to measure certain things that are difficult to measure, but we do our best. So there's a man named Peter Turchin and a group of scientists that have been doing this with history. And it's been fascinating. In 2010, he wrote an article that predicted in 2020 there would be some deep instability in the United States as a result of a combination between popular immiseration and elite overproduction. And the methods that he used come from biology. They come from studying ecological dynamics, and he's applied them to civilizations and found different cycles. And we suspect that intentional communities have a lot of these similar patterns in them. And we want to create a group of researchers that are working together to develop that information, get it into a database, study it together. And so we sort of want to create a utopian cliodynamics. And then, there we go. So we need help. I know a lot of our thoughts are wacky and outside the box, but we think they will go somewhere. We're going to be here working on it. We would love to have help. We need help collecting data, getting access to data. We want to look at intentional community histories. I've got lots of dissertations that I think we can get some really primary data from. And then we also have to develop the models that I alluded to in my abstract in the conference program. We want to be able to look at different communities and be able to determine reasons in a statistical manner over time, why they failed, why they succeeded, what worked, what didn't. That's not just from a subjective survey of participants, but is looking at them from a more mathematical frame that is universal across human groups.
5-minute warning. Oh, maybe you're done.
Yep.
Okay, outstanding. If you could just hit stop sharing, then that'll bring everybody back on the screen. Thank you so much, Christopher. And we have 10 minutes for questions and answers. And again, if you have a question, please use your raise hand function within Zoom, or if you prefer, just raise your physical hand. I can see everyone, so I will be able to recognize that as well. And as we wait for others to work up their courage, I'll start once again with the question. Christopher, could you say a little bit about how you're defining intergroup conflict? I mean, I imagine or intergroup competition, excuse me, because there's, both a question of scale. Are we talking about groups of millions of people or groups of dozens that are in competition? And it also seems that there's really big differences between violence, ideological competition, and then things like business competition, where you might have a lot of competition but still really admire your adversaries. Those seem like they're pretty unrelated. So how do you generalize that a culture has high or low levels of competition?
So I think the first distinction I would make is that a lot of what we're talking about is our ancient evolutionary history that absolutely was a struggle for survival, resources, food, water, territory, and that's still going on today in a lot of the world, where it's being led by the Hicks cultures. And so I think Hicks cultures are much more likely to score high on SDO, social dominance orientation. And it's not a purely ideological thing. It's not a purely developmental issue, although that certainly plays into it. But there's a genetic component and a developmental component that combine to make Hicks predisposed individuals cultures and Licks predisposed individuals and cultures. And I think one of the goals we have is to be able to take this drive for intergroup competition that is really a big part of who Hicks people are, and not only channel it into things like sports and pride in your city and those kinds of things, but to actually have it be oriented towards innovation. And I may disappoint the peaceniks here, but I think that it actually is vitally important that the Licks cultures invite Hicks people into their culture and create a defensive Leviathan collectively through a federation that never wants war, but is practiced and ready to defend the federation of Licks and Hicks who are connected in the lower levels from the larger scale organizations of Hicks that are actually aggressive, bullying, resource rapacious human collectives that are run by authoritarians. And I think that we need to keep our governance systems from having dominance by Hicks culture whenever we can, because in times of scarcity, that culture will recreate itself evolutionarily, and it's designed to thrive in brutal intergroup competition, whereas the licks are designed to do something different, which is what our planet likely needs for us to do. So I don't know. I mean, I could talk more about commerce and stuff, but I did my best to.
Thank you. Who else has a question?
Okay, I can ask one.
Go ahead.
Chris, so if you were to suggest, I hate to put you on the spot, but you could bring it back to me if you don't want to answer this question. But how would you apply this theory to solve the Israel-Hamas conflict?
Oh dear.
I'm sorry. Was that really okay? That's too much. You don't have to answer.
Yeah, I feel like it would be disrespectful here without
okay. Well,
greater
no. If we have
context.
a proposed solution, not a solution, but a proposed solution.
But you and I have discussed this a lot, so I can't stop you from answering your question.
Well, I don't want to offend anybody either, but I think there are two conflicts here, not just one. There's not just a conflict between Israel and Hamas. There's a conflict between the Hicks, which we can also refer to as conservatives or rightists, although that's oversimplistic because it implies a political ideology, whereas Chris was showing it goes a lot deeper than politics. But there is a conflict between the Israeli Hicks, Netanyahu and his coalition, and Hamas. And then there's also a conflict between Hicks and Licks, which is Israeli society is a lot more liberal Lick than Palestinian society. And there are all kinds of issues where I think Palestinians have a village culture and they are forced to live in a big city crowded together. That's asking for trouble. Ironically, I think Hicks could actually, I really get in the intentional community more than modern Licks liberals. So a lot of modern liberals just do not want that scale of human organization. They are much more comfortable with individuals within a nation state or a city and a municipality. And so we need to understand these things. And if we do, solutions might emerge. Like I have one proposed solution is a three-state solution. Instead of Israel and Palestine, we have the Israeli Hicks, Netanyahu, and then the Palestinian Hicks, Hamas, etc. And then the liberals should come together in the Sinai or whoever other country wants to donate territory, and they should have their own state. Which will be thriving, but of course they will need a few Hicks, a few conservatives for defense. Anyway, I know this is sounding crazy and oversimplistic, but I think we need this kind of out of the box instead of these tried and failed solutions like a one state, two state. It failed and it will continue to fail. I think we need to do something different. So a three-state solution with liberals, mostly liberal state, from both Palestinian and Israeli side having their own state and showing how they can thrive together, and let the conservative Palestinians and Israelis fight among each other, mostly, hopefully, among each other, because that's what they're designed and that's what they love to do. Is they need to have wars and fight. Sounds very cynical, but I think it's right now the liberals on both sides are held hostage by the conservatives in this never-ending war. So that's what
no
I
one
think.
else is raising their hand, I'd like to jump in on this issue, because I guess I have a different take, maybe drawn more from United States history. My worry is that oftentimes Lick's culture emerges not from an absence of conflict or competition, but because people have successfully externalized it. So in the United States is founded on genocide and was actively perpetrating genocide for the first 100 years of its history, and yet developed a culture that in many ways is a Lick's culture because the beneficiaries of that genocide were insulated from the conflict itself. And a lot of the super liberal Americans who were creating intentional communities in the 19th century were sons and daughters of slave traders. Again, they might not even realize they were sons and daughters of slave traders, frankly, but they had a lot of benefits that were externalized. And so to just sort of say, you know, the Licks people can live happily together with one another because they're so virtuous, I think sometimes gets, you know, avoids some of the hard realities underlying the emergence of Licks culture.
Yeah, I agree. It's
Amen.
not saying they're more virtuous, it's just saying they're phenotypically different, which has both developmental and genetic and cultural components. But it's not about who is more virtuous or not. Both have virtues and uses.
And I think you raise some important ideas that make me want to clarify. You know, the Hicks and the Licks are at this point hypothetical constructs. I do think they are robust, and I suspect that the Hicks preceded the Licks, and the Licks could never have come into existence were it not for the protection that they didn't come into existence on their own. They you know, the first Lick was evolved within a Hick community, but then took off in a place of safety and greater. I think Licks are generative of higher level organization for our species, and the Hicks are aiming towards lower level group identity, and they sort of represent evolutionary functions for our species as a whole. And there is a convenience that the Licks sort of their whole existence is based in the convenience of living in the safety of Hicks created events. And so I think your point is well taken, and it goes along with this idea that there's always proportions of Hicks and Licks in most human communities. Some secular intentional communities may have more Licks than any societies anywhere, and that's part of why they fail, is because they're missing some of the group boundaries and things that are a vital component of the value system of Hicks. So thanks for pointing that out.
Well, please join me in thanking Christopher for a very dynamic and exciting contribution. And now we will turn to our last presentation, which is by Aharon Ariel Lavi, who is a social entrepreneur who wears many hats as co-founder of Israel's Network of Intentional Communities, Makom, as director of Hakel, an international network of Jewish communities, as manager of the Or Torah Interfaith Center, working on dialogue between Jews and Muslims in Israel-Palestine, and as an Orthodox rabbi. And of course, I would be remiss not to mention that Aharon is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Divinity School. Aharon will be speaking on exploring the connection between loneliness, social disconnection, and political polarization, the recent upheaval in Israel, a case study. Aharon.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for the fascinating discussion, Yuval and Chris. Well, I think my presentation is going to touch on many of the points that have been raised in a more theoretical manner. I would like to try and ground them in some historical context, and look at the actual predicaments and challenges we have right now. I know the original proposal said that we will also touch on Israel's recent upheaval. And just to clarify, when it was submitted, the upheaval was the judicial reform. Now which has been almost completely forgotten since then. Oh, sorry, that's my daughter. So I might touch on it, and I might not. We'll see how time goes, and what will be the best way to do it. So I can share my screen, right? Okay, can you see my screen? Just a minute.
Yes, we see your screen.
Okay. So usually I use this presentation for inside Akel. Akel is a network of over 100 international communities all over the world, Jewish communities. You can see those blue dots. I'm gonna use only the first part of it for the sake of this presentation, which speaks to the larger context we're in. Now I would like to do, I know it's not so customary in academic conferences, but I would like to take 3 minutes for something which is a bit more interactive, some sort of a role play to help us make a point. So I would like, 2 volunteers. Otherwise, I would just choose authoritatively 2 people to volunteer. But can I have 2 volunteers? It's not going to be too complicated. Don't worry. It's just anyone? Well, except for you.
Just choose 2 people.
Just choose. Okay, Helen, are you up for a quick role play?
Are you asking me?
I've only just come
Okay,
on.
no, wait.
All right. Okay. If it's not too complicated.
No, it's very, very simple. And who else? Okay, Yuval, you want to do it?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So, Helen, you'll be the judge, okay? And Yuval, you parked your BMW, whatever it is, in Amsterdam 2022. Well, I should update this to 2024. Doesn't really matter. You park your car in a no parking zone, and they take you to court, and Helen is your judge. Helen, what would be the first question you ask Yuval for committing this hideous crime? Supposedly, allegedly committing this. What would be the first question?
Did you not read? Were you not aware of the no parking sign?
Okay, great, something like that. Or do you pledge guilty or not? Something along
I
those.
won't even go down the line of why on earth you're driving a car in Amsterdam, which is designed for pedestrians and cyclists. But
Oh, that's a whole different question. I agree.
yeah, okay, I have to
Okay.
stick to the law. Yeah.
Yeah. Now let's go 500 years back. And now this is that's Yuval's BMW back then. Well, that's what I just picked a random donkey cart photo. But anyway, he had a horse and a chariot, and he parked it in a no parking zone in Amsterdam 500 years earlier. And you're again the judge. What now would be the first question you ask Yuval?
So I'm trying to get my head around a parking regulation out in open space.
Well, it's a tricky question. That's why I bring this up, of course.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to jump in? I'm Saleh, Chris, Dan. Anyone have any idea what would be the first question back in the 1500s in any medieval European city?
Yes, it would be consulting with the community elders or the community who's governing that space.
That's getting closer. Well, to cut it shorter, the first question would be, Yuval, to which community do you belong to? Because different communities had different legal systems back then. So if you're Jewish, you'll be judged according to the Jewish legal system. If you're a knight, if you're a peasant, it depends on who you are. Now today it's inconceivable. Like today, everybody are equal in front of the law. We judge everybody. At least we try, yeah, but officially we judge everybody equally, no matter their ethnicity, sex, gender, skin color. We don't care. It's not part of the deal. But it was very, very part of the deal back then. The point I'm trying to make is that until not too long ago, maybe 200-300 years ago, an individual could not have considered himself or herself without a community. There was no such thing as an individual. Now, the person who is considered the first individual, it's not necessarily historically true, but is considered to be the first individual, was in Amsterdam around the time. A Jewish guy, his name was Baruch. He's better known as Benedict Spinoza, because he left, or more correctly, he was excommunicated from the Jewish community, but he did not choose to join any other community. He did not join the Christian community or any other, and he he's considered like sort of like the first individual, like the first person who lived without any communal context. Again, historically, this is debatable. There probably have been other people who've done this, but you know, as an historical figure of significance, I think it tells a story. Now, I'm not judging this process. Is it good or bad? I assume not all of us would like to go back to medieval times. But on the other hand, as Yuval said earlier, and Chris said, we have our own challenges in our times. And the question I want to pose or try to answer I have 15 more minutes, right? What happened to us as communal structures have dissolved, as loneliness has spread? What are the political meaning of that? And I will try to touch upon some of the points that Yuval and Chris raised, because well, this is a fascinating discussion that will take much more than 15 minutes. And I believe that's just an opening. So one of the main things that happened since the 1500s, as a disclosure, I'm talking right now about European Western history. I'm aware of that. I'm not an expert on Japanese, Asian, African history. But I can argue that those processes are happening in those areas as well a bit later. But I'm for the sake of time, I'm focusing on this specific area and trend in history. So one of the main things that started to happen in the 1500s and intensified, especially in the 1800s, is that actually responsibility was handed over from the community to the state. Now, the concept of state didn't really exist back then. There were kingdoms or all kinds of local barons or dukes. And their main role was to take taxes and fight wars against other dukes and kings and barons. They didn't operate any welfare systems, judicial systems, educational systems, health systems. This was, even judicial, as I said, even the judicial systems were communal. Everything was communal, except for armies and wars. And this touches upon the Hicks and Licks paradigms. But over time, as religion started to lose ground and technology evolved, more and more needs that were being taken care of by the communities sort of like were handed over to the emerging state, because communities were not there anymore to supply them, because people moved from the villages to cities. So someone had to take care of education, of health, of all kinds of things that traditionally the community dealt with. So that's one thing that happened. Again, much more complex. I'm simplifying this for the sake of time. Second thing is obviously the Industrial Revolution that metamorphosed the way we produce, we consume, we do business, the way the economy works. And the main thing it did, again, trying to focus on what's relevant for us as community builders or researchers, is that, and that's a Marxist idea, even though I'm not a Marxist, but I think at that point he was spot on. It created an alienation between the manufacturer and the product, the people who actually invest the work and the end product. Part of that has to do with the division of labor. Part of that has to do with the accumulation of wealth. So if in the past you'll build a chair from A to Z and then sell your chair in the market and in return buy a goat or whatever it is, so now you produce a small part of a chair and Yuval produces another part, and it's somehow being compiled in China and then being shipped to Australia, and there's no connection between the people who produce and the people who buy and the people in this chain. Now this is important because economy or economic needs were and still are one of the main drivers of human connection. We connect with other people because we need to supply our needs, which we cannot supply by ourselves. So we need to connect with other people. Now we can or could have done it in a communal level, but as Yuval explained, we do it more and more now on an Amazon level, or Amazon, not the tribe, Amazon the website, yeah, or any online. I'm not trying to promote any specific website. You can choose whichever one you want, but we don't have this human connection. We still supply our needs, but we don't have the human connection. So the incentive to invest time in human connections has actually decreased, and the results are, in my opinion, could be negative. Now, another thing that happens so we have relating to this multi-level structure that was explained earlier. So again, to simplify it, let's say you have the humanity, then you have nation, then you have community, then you have family. Once my younger son loved this game of the daughter actually that you just saw. She's my fourth. She loved this game called Kaplas in Israel, that you build a tower of small building blocks, and then you need to pull out some of them and until they fall apart. And if you are the one who caused it to fall apart, then you lose. So when you pull out the communal component from this very, very complex structure, one of the things that happen is that the need for a sense of belonging will have to find some other response or other way to fulfill itself. And I'm saying this because our urge to feel some sense of belonging, that's an existential motivation. It's not something that's nice to have or a privilege. It's something that people would die for, people would kill for. It could explain, and I think you touched on it earlier. It can explain many of the human conflicts. This need to feel that you belong to something. And now the problem is that by default, the easiest way to define who belongs to the group is not to positively educate people on our shared identity, is to simply mark those who are not part of the group, to ostracize someone and then mark the limits of the group. Now, if you have families and communities and have multi-layered societies, so those conflicts are more contained. But as Yuval said, if you don't have those layers, then sometimes they got out of control. And the reason is because the larger the group is, the common denominator will have to be lower. So if the group is no longer a committee of 20, 30, 40 people, 150, as people who mentioned number, which I use a lot as well, if it's not small, if it's huge, so the terms or the common denominator has to be very, very superficial. And then what we get is two things. And in this here, I think I disagree with Yuval and Chris. I don't think there's any substantial difference between conservatives and progressives. My PhD is on conservatism and progressivism and how they play out. Basically, these are just two expressions of the same human, or at least of similar human traits. And we can see both parties and both groups are behaving pretty much the same. So on the right hand, conservative, whatever how you describe it, side, it will be expressed as populism or nationalism. So my group is my nation, and then I have to, in order to keep it tight, I will just ostracize or mark or push out anyone who is not part of that group, to mark the limits of my group and to maintain this sense of belonging. But we also see it on the progressive side in what has been termed as the cancel culture. So, and instead of having a debate and a discussion on values, what we see now, again, not always, not all over the place, in some cases, is that in order to define not a nation in this case, but an ideological group or ideological movement, so we have to kick people out to mark the limits. For example, I gave an example on the right side. On the left side, there was an example, I think maybe 2 years ago at the University of Pennsylvania, if I remember correctly. I don't remember the name of the professor exactly. He gave a lecture on sociology or something like that, and he used the N-word, not in a negative manner. He just used it to tell his students about the history of America, and he touched upon some of the issues that Dan raised. And he was completely ostracized, and I don't know where he is right now, but he suffered a lot. So people use those like trademarks, like those cultural marks to mark the territory of their own group. And again, when we don't have communities and our only sense of belonging is to a huge group, then we have to lower the common denominator. Another thing. What?
5 minutes left.
Okay. Now another thing that I don't think Chris or Yuval mentioned, but this is a game changer. Social media. So this is a bit outdated. It still has Twitter, not X, and doesn't have TikTok. I'll have to update this slide. But I think in the beginning, there were some, I don't know, you were there, I think, at Harvard when Facebook emerged with Mark Zuckerberg. Maybe in the beginning there was some hope that this is going to actually, bring more human connection and more social cohesion, and help us interact and keep us as one society over distance. I dare to say, at least based on research, I'm not going to go into all the research right now, but I have all the papers if you want to see them. I think that after 15 years of research, it's fair enough to say that at the best case scenario, it didn't cause any damage to a social structure or social cohesion or stability. To some extent, it's more likely that it dealt a huge amount of damage. The reason is, and here I will try and touch on biology, and Iuval and Chris, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but because you're more experts on that. The reason is that it's an artificial replacement for community, but it doesn't have the same impact or effect on our minds. So even now, when we sit here in front of computers, the neurological process that goes on in our minds is good. I mean, it's better than being alone, but it's not comparable to what would have happened if we were in the same room and we could smell each other, see our full body language, and not just talking heads. And social media doesn't have this capacity and trait. So I have 3 more minutes. I just want to touch quickly on the crisis of loneliness, and then tie it all back to communities. So this is from a research that was done in Harvard, actually. Anyway, it was a collection of other works that showed that to a large extent, loneliness is the risk factor of loneliness is in creating cardiovascular diseases is almost as high as physical inactivity and only slightly lower than smoking. To put it simply, if you are a couch potato, you don't exercise, you don't eat healthy food, but you have a very strong community that you feel comfortable in and that's fulfilling your lives, your chances of getting a heart attack are actually lower than someone who is physically active, eats well, but is very lonely. Why exactly? There's a whole mechanism. There was a fascinating session in the last round by Boaz that I think really touched on that, on the neurological aspects of living in community. But I put it here to say basically that the crisis I've just described, this dissolution of communities and the transition into well, I'm trying to find a word that won't get me in too much trouble. But the dissolution of communities and the transition into a modern society where we don't have those structures of many people at least don't have the structure of a small community are driving not only social instability and social polarization, as I showed in the last slide. They also drive that's the main risk factor for emotional problems and physical problems and health problems. And I think now we don't have time now to discuss the solution, which I think, and here I echo Iuval and Chris, and I think this whole conference, the different solutions have been proposed to this problem. So you can take medications, you can take, in Israel it's called triple X, but that's a generic name. I'm sure there's all kinds of psychiatric legal materials. You can register to all kinds of online courses. You can go to the local Rotary Club. These are all okay solutions. But from let's say a conservative point of view, just to echo what Iuval said, the best solution is a solution that has been proven efficient and effective over generations. And that solution, I think, is community. And communities are much more affordable, much more accessible than, well, not necessarily more accessible, but they're much more efficient, at least, than other artificial solutions. And I think the big challenge is, and here I disagree a little bit with Iuval and Chris, and with this I conclude, and we'll have some time for questions. I think the challenge is not how to try and roll back world economy and downscale it to the village level, which I think is not doable. And I think the side effects are going to be even worse than climate change. I think the challenge is, and climate change is only one big bad side effect of capitalism. There are many other side effects. The challenge is how to move forward. So I'm offering like a conservative view on progression. Okay, I'm trying to suggest that we need to learn from the past what worked better and see how we can come up with new ideas and new structures for communities moving forward. Exactly how we do it, how can we do it, that's the rest of the presentation where I explain about our project Akel. That's one project that tries to solve this problem in one corner of the world. But maybe I'll stop now and let's take few moments for questions, comments, and the discussion. You're on mute, Dan.
I sure am. So thank you so much, Aharon. If you could just stop your screen share, that'll make it a little easier for everyone to see. And finally, I've gotten the group to behave the way I want them to. Someone has already raised their hand, and that is Yuval. Please ask your question.
If I stop sharing, yeah.
Yeah.
Dan, maybe can I suggest if you cancel the pin speaker function, then we can see all of us. Because now we see only you. You see.
That is more about how you've got your preferences set up.
Okay. Sorry. So yeah. So Yuval, go ahead. Oh, you're right. Okay, now I see it properly. Thank you. You're on mute, Yuval.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay,
yeah,
good. Sorry, I was muted. I really want us to talk a lot more, and I know that you have been really busy with your job as a medic and other things, but the whole thing with liberals and conservatives is it's not really a good term, because the like I said before, the political aspect is only a tip of the iceberg, and there's not a perfect correlation with much deeper things that go on, which is why Chris uses Hicks and for conservatives and Licks roughly for liberals, right? But it's not a very good mapping. We are exploring, we're through surveys, the hypothesis that cancel culture and what sometimes derogatorily has been named as wokesters are actually Hicks. Even though they have a progressive political ideology, they are really, on many measures, not just moral foundations, values, but some of the big five and some of the genetic factors that Chris has identified, and also some developmental measures and things that have been looked before, like the authoritarian personality scale or right-wing authoritarianism scale. So the cancel culture, is not really liberal in important ways, but we should just drop liberal and let's just talk about Hicks and Licks, or we could talk about rigor and imagination, or some other dichotomy. And of course these things have they're not binary either. They have spectra, and since they happen at many levels, it's not clear whether like what part of it being continuous is due to discreteness at lower levels, but just proportions of different things that are discrete. Anyway, there's all kinds of issues that are related to the whole liberal conservative, but I just wanted to say that we may not actually be disagreeing on the thing about cancel culture. And of course, all humans, whether they're Hicks or Licks, need to feel like they are part of some group. That applies to both Hicks and Licks. The main difference that Chris was talking about is that Hicks are much more into out-group conflict and dislike and hatred even at times. So than Licks. Okay, just to make that clear.
No, I agree with this distinction. And you have Hicks and Licks on the progressive side, the conservative side. It's not, as I said, it's a basic human trait, and no one can avoid that. It's just Chris, you had a question?
I just wanted to clarify a little bit, add some nuance, and I love that you brought up cancel culture and wokeism as synonymous with some of the behaviors, and I'm glad that that's part of this discussion. I think it's also related to the polarization in Europe and the US around the Hamas-Israeli war. And I think that there's very similar complexities where, you know, our hypothesis is that there's individuals who were raised in Hicks cultures who rejected the culture that they're from, but brought those cultural leanings to a leftist ideology space. And it's an interesting situation because on the left, it's really a strong value for inclusion and creating space for marginalized groups and historically marginalized groups to have their say and to have power. And so I think there's a lot of leftists who will not disagree with someone who has fundamentalist Hicks-style views on left and right coming from the left. We're not going to disagree with them publicly, even though we disagree with them internally, because we want to give them a space to be themselves and to have some power, even though we may not, you know, support the final aims that they're gearing towards. But I think that's something that we actually are attempting to study through survey research, is to see if there are developmental experiences that correlate with fundamentalist liberalism, which is another term I would use to describe the cancel culture stuff.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions or? Okay. Oh, want to say something else? Please.
So one of the things that really interests me about the kibbutzim is there is sort of an evolution where the secular and the religious have come together in some sense in the historical trajectory of the movement in some places. And so I'm curious, like in our theoretical conceptions, that is a front line of this intentional community development of having Hicks and Licks embedded together in a group, at least in theory.
I really want to take my last 2 minutes to touch upon that and really speak for 2 minutes on Israel. I'm not going to speak about the war or Hamas. I live on the Gaza border, by the way, so I was here on October 7th. I experienced this firsthand. But I want to talk about that because what we've seen in Israel is that international communities have a very strong moderating effect. And the largest coalition of right-wing, left-wing, secular, religious, Hicks, however you define it, in Israel is actually the national, Anton, 1 minute, I'm going to talk about you, is actually the national coalition of international communities. So Anton belongs to again, very, very simplistic, a left-wing, secular urban kibbutz in the north. I belong to an orthodox, right-leaning community in the south. But we are both part of this Makom network that has over 250 communities, and we work together as a coalition. And I think the reason is that because we live in communities, and we have these shorter feedback loops that Yuval mentioned earlier, I didn't have time to touch on it. So we have more, we don't have any better genes. We just have more practice and experience in with other people, seeing other opinions, resolving conflicts, and we have more patience just to people with other opinions. We don't see this as a threat necessarily because we live in this tension all day long. And that's really in a nutshell. I see we're out of time, but I think that in one sentence, building communities is not just for us to have fun and have a nicer life and, you know, do compost. It actually has ramifications and implications on social stability, social cohesion, economic equality, and on many, many other issues. And this tool has been overlooked for too long. It's time to reclaim it.
Well, please join me in thanking all of our presenters for a fabulous session, very well connected, lots of great conversations that I am sure will continue in the other sessions. We have 3 choices in our next time slot. Just maybe for a quick review. Here in room A, Vincent Reynolds will be presenting on nurturing positive relationships between people from diverse cultural backgrounds at Camp Hill Glen Craig. In session B, where I'm going to be the Zoom tech, Carl Nasser and Francesca Hernandez Singer will be speaking on Inside Out, the Psychology of Intentional Communities. And over in room C, we have a book event on Better to Have Gone by Akash Kapoor, which I believe is on Oroville, but don't quote me on that. Take your 15-minute break and look forward to seeing you at the next session.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you.